Amelia, thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
How's today going so far? I know it's always a marathon, right?
It's good. It's good. I feel like sometimes I'm like the questions in my head get all muddled, but it's all good.
Understandable. Well, I really enjoyed catching Bloodthirsty when I had the opportunity to watch it this weekend, and just have a few questions about sort of your background before getting to Bloodthirsty, but then also kind of what makes these films tick for you. Because I picked out a few things that I think were very intentional. So I want to get your perspective on that. But
Sounds good.
um, so watching Bloodthirsty, it really reminded me of old kind of like Wes Craven type films, and just how simple the story is, but impactful in the way that you're telling it and the themes that you're trying to touch on, especially when it comes to the main character. What horror influences were you working with when making this film, but then also others that you have in your repertoire?
Yeah, I mean, I think a major horror director for me is Cronenberg that I always kind of go back to that's influenced my style a lot in terms of like practical effects and kind of practical effects as like in a kind of a aesthetic extension of the characters, like rather than kind of like specifically going for realism, like letting them kind of be an aesthetic unto themselves. And like body horror in general. Like I really like that as a subgenre and like what he's done in the past. Yeah, for this film, so like The Fly, there was like definitely some
Sure.
few influences there. American Werewolf in London, obviously, because just of course. And then the film Raw, which came out in 2016, I think it was, which is
Yes.
yeah,
I believe so.
the French cannibal film that involves women eating flesh. So that was a film that I really enjoyed that I thought of as well when making this.
Very good. Well, that's a great segue into, before I even read up on some of the background that you bring to the table in terms of what you're trying to accomplish in the films that you're making. The focus on a female lead, especially in your last two films, is obviously very intentional, but the topics that you're addressing through horror is really interesting to me. Mainly because I think you're focusing on areas that aren't often told uh, in films outside of dramas or straight dramas. But why horror to really tap into some of these female anxieties that are so prevalent today?
Yeah, I mean, I've always just been a big fan, and I grew up watching a lot of horror films, a lot of like Hammer horror films from like the 60s and
Sure.
70s. So there was an aesthetic and like a feel that was always just like that I just always really enjoyed. And then when I went to film school, like people didn't really make horror movies, and it kind of just that wasn't really a thing you did. And so it wasn't really until that I was like finishing film school that I made my short Undress Me, which is like a body horror film.
Mhm.
And I decided with that, I was like, I'm just really going to embrace this, and I'm not going to like, think about it any other way than like this is a body horror film. And then once I did that, I just realized that it was very much kind of like an area that I felt comfortable in, that I felt like I was able to kind of like thrive in and like do interesting stuff because I was familiar with it as a genre. And I think there's a lot of space to kind of subvert expectations or play with tropes or whatever that is, because there's so much like going into it. Like you watch a film and you see like a dark cabin in the woods, and you just like already sudden you like already think of like what the film's going to be, right? So you can embrace that and it's fun, or you could subvert that and play with those expectations. So I just like that as a kind of arena to play around. And then it's interesting what you said about maybe topics that are dealt more within kind of dramas, because I feel like I definitely think that's something I maybe try to do, or try to look at things that are very true to kind of like social dynamics
Mhm.
or humanity, whether that's like social anxiety or social expectations or just kind of navigating social spaces, but then taking it into a kind of more like heightened horror space, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the subversion of expectations that you're talking about with, especially this film. There's a deeper story in terms of, what Gray is going through, and sometimes with a horror movie, it's fun to just be able to shut off the outside world and enjoy, the craziness that may come. But the deeper meaning within this film is actually, I think, pretty neat. One of the other things that I really appreciated in this film, as someone that identifies in the LGBTQIA community, is how Gray, of course, is in a same-sex relationship, and it's not a focus of the film. And when I say that, I mean, of course, she goes and meets, creepy Vaughn and introduces her girlfriend, and Vaughn just moves on. Like it's not like, oh, well, that's neat, which you get so many times in other films, and it kind of makes it more of a distraction than anything else. Was that intentional, or is it, something? Is that something that you're hoping to play with in some of the stories that you want to tell?
That was very intentional. Like I really just wanted to feel like it there was nothing out of the ordinary, because that's how it should be.
Right.
And this isn't a film about queer identity, and I think that there needs to be a plethora of films about that and from different perspectives and everything. And it's not to say people don't experience homophobia or anything like that, but just in this particular film, it was like it just didn't feel necessary to draw attention to the fact that they're gay. It just doesn't make a difference. So even in the script, there was a few kind of like that scene you're talking about. Actually, Vaughn did have a reaction a little bit, just like a micro thing, and I was like, let's not do this because it just felt like it doesn't matter. And it's a horror movie that happens to have a gay couple in it. Right. And it's not a plot point. And both Lauren Beatty, who plays Gray, and Catherine King-So, who plays Charlie, are both queer performers. So it was really great to work with them as well, because I think that a lot of times they don't get opportunities to play, gay characters. So that was a really cool part of it as well, was working with them.
I absolutely love that it wasn't made a plot point, because I think that as we're getting more exposure in terms of, the diversity of the queer community in film, it does a lot of times become one of the main focuses of the film. And, it gets dissected and picked apart, but just to have it as sort of quote unquote the norm in the film is just very comforting. And it kind of caught me off guard when it first happened. So I do appreciate that.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah.
When you're talking about Lauren Beatty, of course, you've worked with her multiple times now. Is there more coming down the road with Lauren, or?
I hope so one day, nothing specific, but I love working with her, and I think she's very, very talented.
Yeah. She's definitely, I think for this role especially, really communicated sort of the inner turmoil of trying to figure out what was going on with her. But turning over to the music real quick, that was one part that also really surprised me, is when we get to the Bloodthirsty song. It was kind of a jam, huh? Like I was really into it for a little while. I'm like, wow, this caught me off guard.
I had it stuck in my head for months and months and months. So.
I can't imagine.
Yeah.
But it's incredibly catchy. It's well performed, and it's very unexpected in a horror film. Was there always sort of that? Obviously, it's part of the story, but to give it that much breath and that much time in the film, was that always a focus of Bloodthirsty?
Yeah, for sure. Lowell, who co-wrote the script, wrote all the music, like all the songs that exist in the film. And when I first read the script, I immediately looked at her music because I was kind of curious about how it would sound, and it kind of helped me understand the script a bit better and the character a bit better. But I also knew like it's a difficult thing to get right in a film. So once I heard her music, I was like, okay, that's covered. That's going to be good. And then my approach was, I guess, was really just trying to make it feel like they're writing an album, and that it's not like that it's a work in progress, and that we're kind of watching a creative process. Because a lot of times in films about music, it's just like they write it and it's perfect, and versus something that is maybe a little unfinished. And so that was something I think with Lauren too, that we talked about, of like not letting the songs feel perfect, and they kind of get to that place, but that she's writing and we're watching her write, so that was really the way I wanted it to be seen in the film.
Which makes sense. I mean, we spend a lot of time in the recording studio and trying to get that right. I think there's one scene in particular where it's the same line sung over and over again, just trying to get there. But that again, I think goes to the character herself, and it was really neat to see. My last question is just regarding the special effects. I mean, looking at the transformation, so to speak, of when Vaughn gets into sort of his alter ego character in a sense. What did you want to go full ham with that, or was it just a matter of like the small little touches that show that there's that beast side of him?
Yeah, I mean, when I came on board, the look for the creature was already kind of established in terms of not doing something like someone in a wolf costume, like because a big part of it was budget reasons as well, like in terms of like VFX and stuff like that. So I knew that was the approach, to more of a kind of a hybrid creature, and I know that might not be for everyone. And if you're going in wanting like a werewolf movie, you know, this might not check that box. But for me, it was like trying to do something a bit different and working with those limitations. And trying to just kind of, yeah, I think like there's something interesting that I found when we were on set doing the transformation scene with Lauren in the recording booth, where even though she has heavy prosthetics on, like we still kind of see her and her emotions. Whereas like when you are just like, okay, now we're CGI, or now we're a puppet, or now, you know, someone's in a suit, like you kind of lose that connection with the character. So I think it's an interesting byproduct that by going more subdued with the makeup, we still kind of see the human in her a little bit. So yeah, for me, it was just kind of a matter of like embracing those limitations and trying to do something interesting with it. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. And I mean, it's always nice to make the most out of a low budget production, right? But I think that in this case, it really works because you're exactly what you're saying with the emotion. You never lose sight of that. And I really enjoy that about the film.
Thank you.
So what's next? What are we sticking with horror moving forward, or are we going to be branching off?
Yeah, I would imagine so. I think regardless, I'm pretty drawn to kind of dark stories and dark characters. So that'll probably continue no matter what. And I think horror is a really vast genre. There's so much you can work within. So I imagine I will stick with it.
Well, I'm very excited to see what comes of that, because the dark horror and the dark stories and dark dramas, I really enjoy kind of seeing that played in, or that playground played in, I should say, because I think there's a lot to pull out, especially from like the human emotion. So I think you definitely do that extremely well, given Bloodthirsty, and I'm excited to see what comes down the road. But I appreciate you taking the time today.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was nice to talk with you.
Of course. Thank you, Brad.
Thanks, sir.